Warning. Warning.
On October 10th, I was doom scrolling through my timeline on what was once called Twitter. Social media platforms have become avenues to spread misinformation during a crisis, and the worst of the worst were in full force that day. The right wing and their hapless liberal accomplices called for collective punishment against Palestine, justified by mindless, heartless propaganda as if civilians who had long suffered under apartheid were somehow responsible, impossibly, for their own deaths. Nobody learned anything from 9/11, with the exception of those who discovered how best to weaponize nationalistic zealotry. Democrats, Republicans, and their innumerable bots bickered at each other over who should be Speaker of the House, who should be the symbolic frontman of their band of murderers and thieves. The right-wing guy, or the right-wing guy, or the really right-wing guy. How do you choose among a white supremacist, a Trumpian fascist, and a Christo-fascist? The Biden administration announced, a few days prior, that it would begin expanding the border wall begun by the Trump administration, deporting thousands of immigrants who traveled to the United States seeking asylum in the nation most responsible for their impoverished conditions and destabilized economies. And all these blue wave freaks had to say about it was better than Trump. A barely defensible half-truth that is beginning to erode altogether. And then, light in the distance. A piece of actual good news. A hardly even important scrap of popular culture anesthetic. A reclusive artist, most famous for creating greatest of all time newspaper comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, had produced another significant work for the world to enjoy, an illustrated fable for adults entitled The Mysteries. At long last, after decades of waiting, Bill Watterson wrote a new book. To clarify, although Watterson himself is credited as the writer, the illustrations are a collaboration between himself and caricaturist John Kashk. The day of its release, October 10th, was the first time I had heard of this new book. Once a year, for as long as search engines existed, I typed Bill Watterson to see whether or not the J.D. Salinger of comics was up to anything. When it appeared on my timeline, I rushed down to the nearest Barnes & Noble. I didn't want to order the book online and wait a day or two for it to arrive. I had waited long enough. We all had. In the years following the end of his famous comic strip, Watterson had written and drawn little else that had been made public. In 1999, he wrote a short article in the Los Angeles Times about the anniversary of the comic strip Peanuts. In 2008, he wrote the foreword to a comic strip Collected Works by Richard Thompson. Years later, he and 4 other men wrote a kind of tribute to the art of Richard Thompson, and in 2014, Watterson provided guest illustrations for 3 strips of Pearls Before Swine, and that's about it. Watterson almost never gives interviews, almost never makes public appearances, and he seemingly has no interest in returning to the art form that made him famous, nor endeavoring in many other public projects. Watterson paints in his spare time, but rarely shows anyone his work. He shuns the spotlight. He doesn't live in isolation, though. He just lives what he considers to be an ordinary life. Even the release of The Mysteries was done without much fanfare. No wonder I was caught off guard. Everyone was. 2023's The Mysteries is only about 72 pages long, but that figure might give a false impression. 72 pages is either close to the maximum length of a short story or the minimum length of a novella, or novelette. However, half of the pages in The Mysteries are illustrations, and the pages with words usually only have a sentence or two. In form only, The Mysteries resembles what is sometimes called a children's book, but this is described by the creators as a fable for adults, not children. A picture book is perhaps the best descriptor, although one online retailer, the worst one, calls it a fantasy manga, which just cannot be true. The Mysteries is not a novel, but let's examine this based on that criteria for a moment. Whether a work of fiction is a novelette, novella, or novel is more commonly characterized by word count, not page count. In total, The Mysteries is approximately 370 words long. Not pages, words. The exact count depends on whether or not we consider the title and whether a hyphenated word counts as 1 or 2 words. To give you some idea of how short that is, at this point in the video that you're watching, you're about 900 words deep, more than twice the length of this smallish book. The Mysteries can be finished in a matter of minutes. Yet this book is arguably Watterson's most significant work since the end of Calvin and Hobbes, nearly 3 decades ago. Calvin and Hobbes was a comic strip that ran from 1985 to 1995. For young people growing up in the 80s and 90s, this was the newspaper comic strip. Garfield made more money through merchandising and television shows, Peanuts had a longer run, but Calvin and Hobbes was the cool comic strip for kids. The collected works were hot items at book fairs. Calvin was the imaginative, rebellious child that we all wanted to be, despite his glaring flaws, and Hobbes was the best friend that we all desperately wanted. Most strips centered around Calvin seeing the world differently than the other children and his parents, imagining himself as a private detective or a space adventurer. His teacher, babysitter, and parents were his various arch-nemeses, plotting his destruction. Calvin had no friends except for his stuffed tiger, Hobbes, only an antagonistic relationship with Susie Durkins, and a passing familiarity with the other students. Some children read Calvin and Hobbes because it was funny. Other children read Calvin and Hobbes because it was, tragically, relatable. In this strip from October 30th, 1987, Calvin imagines himself as Stupendous Man, hearing a cry for help in a nameless city. As the superhero, he leans over the edge of the building, remarking on both the height and danger. The next panel is the punchline. Calvin is actually atop a slide, clearly afraid to go down but unwilling to acknowledge that to Susie or to himself. In this strip from November 3rd, 1988, Calvin wears his Stupendous Man costume to dinner. He claims that being Stupendous Man while eating is necessary, offering only that the caped hero has a stomach of steel. In this strip, Calvin, as Stupendous Man, performs the time travel trick from the 1978 Superman film in order to give himself another day before his homework is due. In a multi-part strip, Calvin is once again struggling with his homework and once again becomes Stupendous Man to solve the problem. This time he goes further and turns his school into a smoking crater in the ground. No school, no homework. Calvin's mother takes away his costume. What commonalities do we see in these early Stupendous Man strips? Calvin becomes Stupendous Man when he is under duress, when he is afraid of the world around him. Becoming a superhero and invincible titan allows himself protection from the world. Notice that Stupendous Man never actually saves anyone in these stories, he only saves himself from what he perceives to be danger. His mother, his babysitter, etc. Let's juxtapose these with other strips. In an earlier strip from 1985, Calvin is shown to be uncomfortable at the dinner table. His father won't even tell him what he's eating. Now we can laugh and say that maybe Calvin is a fussy eater, but Watterson obviously sympathizes with Calvin. Why must Calvin sit there and eat food that he clearly despises? Why can't his parents just level with him? As a child, I was not outwardly critical of the food I was given because I was afraid. In the house where I grew up, we did not have a lot of money, and saying that I wouldn't eat something because I didn't like it would make me feel guilty. I was raised very Catholic, and guilt is simply part of the deal. Church on Sunday, Catholic school, nuns, sacraments, confessing sins, waking up early because I was an altar server. I did not like going there. I didn't realize at the time that the constant guilt and talk of sin would have a profoundly negative impact on me. When I watch the news or scroll through my timeline and see war and poverty, something in my head tells me that it's my fault. I remember dropping a grocery bag once and spilling something. It couldn't have cost more than a few dollars, and I don't recall even being punished for it, but I felt terrible and I still think about it to this day. It's just in there. Calvin has the opposite problem, but it is no less painful. In Calvin's case, he is vocal about his displeasure. Strip after strip shows Calvin is sensitive to certain smells, textures, and tastes. But his parents imply that he is spoiled, and that choking down food that makes him genuinely nauseous will build character. How can Calvin possibly enjoy his dinner if his father openly admits that it's not unlike a form of punishment, that it will harden Calvin and make Calvin more like his father? Watterson clearly sympathizes with Calvin. It's not enough to tell a child to do something that they despise and hope that the child won't resent the parent for it on some level. Parents have to be better than that. Calvin is a handful, to say the least, but his parents don't always have the best advice or make the best choices. No parents do. For the record, forcing a child to eat food that they find disgusting and punishing a child by force-feeding them is abuse. This is not a controversial opinion in child psychology circles. The long-term harm this does to children includes eating disorders and other traumas. Many children are sensitive to particular smells and tastes, and forcing them to relive this discomfort 3 meals a day is especially hazardous. In this strip from 1985, Calvin is accused of simply not paying attention in class. We see inside Calvin's imagination that he was thinking about being Spaceman Spiff, an intergalactic adventurer. In this strip from February 1986, Calvin is accused of the same thing and his persona is once again Spaceman Spiff. In this strip from later that year, Calvin is once again accused of not paying attention and once again is Spiff. Same thing in this one. Noticing a pattern here. I entered the term paying attention into a Calvin and Hobbes search engine and found that a disproportionate amount were about Spaceman Spiff. Watterson uses different Calvin personas depending on which challenge Calvin is facing. When Calvin is afraid, he becomes Stupendous Man. When Calvin is bored, he becomes Spaceman Spiff. I didn't notice this as a child. I guess I wasn't paying attention. Calvin is an inventive, imaginative child, and those talents could be molded into a promising career, but he's not receiving the right kind of attention to assist with this goal. A common point of discussion among modern-day Calvin and Hobbes fans is that Calvin is probably dealing with undiagnosed ADHD. This infamous, fan-made comic strip draws a lot of criticism and praise depending on one's perspective. Despite the signature, it was absolutely not made by Bill Watterson. He would never do this. In one perspective, Calvin just needs the proper medication to get him through his schoolwork. Calvin is often portrayed as clever and full of ideas, even philosophical. If he could merely harness that, he could really be someone special when he becomes an adult. Without the proper care, Calvin might be doomed to a more mediocre life. Yet, in the final panel of this fan-made comic strip, isn't that what's happening? Isn't Calvin becoming mediocre but in a different way? That is the other perspective. Is this comic strip cynical or supportive? Hopeful or flavorless? Whether this is a sad ending or a happy ending is a Rorschach test for how we remember our childhoods and for how we see neuroatypical conditions. Regardless of how one views this as either a triumph or as the beginning of a more melancholy existence for Calvin, children should be tested for a wide range of neuroatypical conditions. What the family does with that information and what a child does with that information upon adulthood will vary, but having something undiagnosed and unknown altogether leaves the child without any option for dealing with it later in life. The premise of Calvin and Hobbes is that Calvin sees the world one way and everyone else sees the world another way. Whether or not Hobbes is real was this contentious question among young fans at the time. Watterson purposefully refused to answer that, not in the narrative and not in his rare interviews. Hobbes felt real, and that made sense to us. When we were children, everything felt magical and monstrous because we didn't have a lifetime of experience to temper our expectations or desensitize us to trauma. Everything was new, everything was a surprise, everything was shocking. We weren't able to protect ourselves. Calvin's imagination rang especially true for some of us. I did not have an imaginary friend as a child. I had imaginary worlds. I spent my days walking around the block endlessly, barefoot and ignoring everything around me. I have the calluses to prove it. I lived in other worlds where I could be somewhere else, someone else. I ventured into sewers on a regular basis. Nobody stopped me. There was an entrance near a wooded area, not really a forest, that was big enough to walk into. It only led to the sewer, but it felt like it could have led anywhere. This is not a picture of it, but it looked something like this. I don't remember some specifics about my childhood. I seem to be especially incapable of remembering when things happened. When people ask me, I say, I don't know. When I was 8, 12, what do you want from me? I was called imaginative and artistic, but was actually suffering from a number of undiagnosed conditions. Most of them are still technically undiagnosed. I think I had come to prefer it that way. I'm tired of always being a new word. On October 10th, I walked into the Barnes & Noble and asked, where can I find the mysteries? An employee led me to a section full of mystery novels. She misunderstood my question, and even though I thought I was being clear at first, I felt terribly embarrassed that I hadn't communicated myself correctly. It was my fault. My fault. my fault. I tried to explain, and another employee overheard and showed me where I could find Watterson's new book in the store. He looked about my age, and I suspect he might have read Calvin and Hobbes when he was a kid too. When he found a copy of the Mysteries, he said, "It's beautiful. You'll love it." I became emotional in public, and the employee was nice enough to pretend that he did not notice. So, Bill Watterson wrote a new book, and it's great. It truly is beautiful, and it now has a special place on my bookshelf. I have a degree in English, but I'm not a professional literature critic. So, here's what I think about it. It's the story of a kingdom that feared undefined mysteries lurking in the shadows. When the knights captured a mystery, they learned its power, and the mystery became less frightening. Over time, more and more mysteries were revealed, creating more and more advances in technology. When the world, spoilers here, is destroyed, the mysteries continued, because the universe exists independent of human consciousness, independent of our imagination. Things simply are. The mysteries of the universe will go on without us because we do not invent the universe. We only witness the universe. We are irresponsible with what we learn, but we're also, paradoxically, responsible for nothing. We are not important enough to be so responsible. Watterson sees the world eating itself. I see it too. But when we are gone, the universe will continue uninterrupted. That might sound defeatist, especially in the face of annihilation, but it's also quite comforting to know that we don't have to put that much pressure on ourselves. In the grand scheme of a universe that has existed for billions of years, we are all children. We should keep trying, of course, but we don't have to feel guilty all the time. It wasn't our fault.